been a philosopher since then. He's decided to come out at the invitation of Westside Catholic couples to speak to them on Saturday night, and offered to speak to us tonight on the subject of warriors in the wasteland. And he's going to give us his interpretation of what it means to be soldiers of Christ, witnesses of faith, and victors in heaven. I'll turn it over to him now.
Well, thank you all for coming out to hear an absent-minded professor of philosophy address the very practical question of spiritual warfare. Some of you might be old enough to remember 9/11, when you suddenly realized that we're at war. When that happens, everything changes. A new kind of consciousness slips in. We're not at peace, we're at war. When you're at war, you don't worry about little things, like how comfortable the beds are or how good the food is. War is a matter of life or death. Well, ever since then, most of us are aware that we have been at war. I'm not talking about a physical war with terrorists. I'm talking about a spiritual war. In our culture, there's three kinds of war. There's literal, physical, military war. There's supernatural, spiritual war, which is the case all the time, ever since a certain incident with a snake and an apple in the Garden of Eden. And then there's something between the two called a culture war. Some cultures are at peace with themselves. Ours is not. It is at war with itself. A culture is basically the spiritual aspect of a civilization. It's basically the values of a civilization, the philosophy of a civilization, the wisdom of a civilization. And what used to be called, for almost 2,000 years, Christendom, is now simply Western civilization. And it is massively secular. The three forms of war are connected. A culture war is sort of in the middle between spiritual war and military war. It's the effect of spiritual war, and it's the cause of military war. For instance, the Civil War was a military war caused by the conflict of two cultures, pro-slavery and anti-slavery. World War II was a military war caused by two different philosophies, democracy and totalitarianism, fascist totalitarianism. The Cold War, which erupted into a military war in both Korea and Vietnam and elsewhere, was also a military war fueled by a culture war about communism. So if we are now in a culture war, who are the two sides? Who is our enemy? You can't have a war without enemies. Some people still think we have no enemies. The Bible disagrees. The word enemy is used over 300 times in the Bible. So who is our enemy? Well, it's not slave masters. Slavery is illegal, although the effects of slavery still bother America with its leftover racisms. It's not totalitarianism versus democracy like World War II, although our society is becoming more and more what the greatest book, I think, ever written about democracy, namely de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, calls soft totalitarianism. It's not even the USSR versus the US. The USSR doesn't exist anymore. Although Russia is still making trouble. It's not terrorism, Islamic or otherwise. In fact, many Muslims are on our side in the culture war. It's not even Democrats versus Republicans, although that's relevant. They are farther apart than they ever were in history. I think the essence of the culture war is, and our enemy is, the Antichrist. That's one side. Who's the other side? Who are we? We are soldiers of Christ. Soldiers of Christ. Women as well as men. In most animal species, women fight even more fiercely than men. The culture war is not, first of all, political. Now, I don't know about Ohio. I do know that until the last election, Ohio was always in the middle, and whoever Ohio voted for got to be president. That ended in the 21st century. But in the People's Republic of Massachusetts, on the other hand, we have a 13-to-1 ratio between the two parties. And many people in my state, I hope this is not so true of Ohio, are much more religiously passionate about politics than about religion. Religion is a subdivision of politics rather than vice versa. Religion and politics have exchanged places. They're political about their religion and religious about their politics. Well, that's doubly stupid. Because if one thing is much more important than another, if one thing is, let's say, a first thing, and another thing is a second thing, for instance, let's say health is more important than money, then if you reverse that hierarchy and you sacrifice a first thing for a second thing, not only will you miss the first thing, you'll mess up the second thing. You'll become addicted to it. If you're addicted to your money, you're not going to spend money for health care and you'll die. If you're addicted to alcohol, you're going to spoil not only the pleasures of eating, but the pleasures of drinking it. Jesus said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these other things will be added." All these other things, what's that? Finite goods, lesser goods, goods designed by God for our joy, for our happiness. They're perfectly good. But if we idolize them, if we become addicts of them, not only do we miss God, we miss them. And politics is one of them. To idolize politics is always bad politics. To sacrifice our relationship to God for our relationship to our ideology not only throws God out the door, it throws all the good of political ideology, whatever it might be, also out the door. All right, if our enemy is the Antichrist, if our enemy is not just a political party or even just an ideology, if the Bible is right in saying we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of wickedness in high places. And St. Paul, when he wrote those words, wasn't talking about the emperor, who was a tyrant and a pagan. He was talking about someone much worse than the emperor, who hated and was persecuting Christians. He was talking about Satan, the devil. If Satan doesn't exist, if there are no evil spirits, then Jesus was the biggest fool in the world, because he came to defeat the devil. He should have stood away. Why bother if he doesn't exist, if he's a myth? He freed people from the devil. He conversed with the devil. He knew the devil. He was tempted by the devil. He had dialogues with him. Subtract the devil from Christianity, you don't have anything left. Now, I'm a philosopher, and I'm looking at this from a philosophical point of view. So you'll have to forgive me for telling you what I know and not what I don't know. So the psychological sources, the sociological sources, the political sources of the culture war, I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the philosophical sources of the culture war. And the philosopher who, of all philosophers in history, is now the most popular, as judged by how many students in philosophy courses at various universities in Western civilization, that is Europe and North America, write books about him, is Friedrich Nietzsche, who, as far as I know, is the only person in human history who proudly labeled himself the Antichrist and called Christianity the synthesis of all possible errors. His most famous saying is, "God is dead." And he dared to draw all the logical consequences of that. If God is dead, then it follows that man, God's image, is also dead. Here, think of this little thought experiment. There's a man standing in front of a mirror. The man is real. The image in the mirror is simply a reflection of that man. If the man didn't exist, the image of that man in the mirror would not exist. Now imagine that man is God, and imagine that the image of that man in the mirror is mankind. The man suddenly leaves the room. Not quite instantly, but almost instantly, his image in the mirror also disappears. But because light takes time to move, it moves very fast, but it moves. There's a split second between the time the man has exited the room and the time his image exits from the mirror. We are now living in that instant. If man is the image of God, man cannot survive the death of God. Now, of course, God can't die, but faith can die. Our relationship to God can die. Satan knows very well that he can't kill God, but he can kill our souls. He can kill our relationship to God. He can kill our faith in God. He can kill the image in the mirror. And that's what Nietzsche explicitly tried to do. He hated man. He loved the new man, the Superman, the Overman, who was totally without religion and without morality. If God is dead, then what God is dead. One of those things is love, which Nietzsche thought was a contemptible weakness. Another is truth, which Nietzsche called simply another word for God, or God without a face. Nietzsche prided himself for being the first philosopher who dared to question the so-called will to truth. Why truth, he said. Why not rather untruth? What's left? Not God, not man, not love, not truth. Power. The will to power. Power, according to Nietzsche, is not a means to an end, and thus neutral. It can be used for either good ends or bad ends. No, power is the only end. It's an end in itself. The most popular, or at least one of the most popular philosophies around today in most humanities departments is called deconstructionism, and it appeals to Nietzsche more than to any other philosopher. It says that truth is simply power. It's a rationalization for power. And it says everything comes down to war between races, genders, and economic classes. The true racists are those who say everything is racial. The true sexists are saying that everything is gender. If you are white rather than black, if you're a man rather than woman, if you are bourgeois, middle class, instead of either very poor or very rich, you're the enemy. And according to this philosophy, the entire history of the human race has been a war between the oppressors and the oppressed. Well, that's a very, very dark view of man. That's the clear and extreme version of it. Something like that is the drift position, the shallow position, the shallow water of the sea. This is not only Nietzsche, it's also Marx. Marx's favorite quotation was the quotation from the devil in Goethe's great drama Faust, repeated 3 times in that play. Everything that exists deserves to perish. It's a death wish. The BBC polled English citizens a couple of decades ago, asking who is the greatest philosopher who ever lived. Ordinary people in the UK answered that question, and by far, Marx won number 1. Well, that's probably naivete. I don't think Marx would win number 1 in Russia, but the British haven't lived under Marxism. They don't know how bad it is. How serious is this? Well, if there's no God, and therefore no divine commandments, no moral law, if morality is just a human invention, a game, then there's no such thing as sin. And if there's no sin, there's no repentance. And according to our highest authority, if there's no repentance, there's no salvation. So this is not just an issue of philosophy and truth. This is an issue of eternal life and death. So this is about as serious a war as you can get. What is its main battlefield? Or at least what began it? What accounts for it? Why is it so sudden? Why is almost everybody talking about, or at least thinking in terms of, a culture war today rather than a generation or two ago? What happened in the latter half of the 20th century? Well, I think the answer to that is embarrassingly obvious. What happened in the latter half of the 20th century is probably the greatest, in the sense of the most important, technological revolution since the discovery of fire. It's the sexual revolution. What? Well, in order to prove that apparently extreme statement, let me ask you, if man is the image of God, what does that mean? And where do you go for an answer? Well, let's try the Word of God. Let's try the Bible. The first time the phrase, the image of God, is used and applied to man is in Genesis, in the creation story. And God made man in his own image. What are the next words? Male and female. Male and female is not just biology. Our relationship to each other, meant to be a relationship of love, is now a relationship of oppressor and oppressed. Masculinity and femininity are both enemies of Satan because they are the two halves of the image of God. So Satan hates them both and wants to destroy them both. He loves it when so-called feminists hate their femininity and try to imitate the worst features in man. And Satan loves it when men are embarrassed by their masculinity. The results of the sexual revolution, all made possible by the technological invention of effective contraceptives, which separate sex from its divinely ordained meaning, namely love and procreation. Well, we all know what they are. Lust, pornography, fornication, adultery, contraception, divorce, sodomy, transgenderism. Take divorce. I love to talk to Protestants who say that the Catholic Church is oppressive, unlike Jesus. And I say, well, what do you mean? Well, Catholics don't believe in divorce. I said, neither did Jesus. He forbade it in all three Gospels. So you think you're more faithful to the Bible than we are? Divorce is suicide. It's the suicide of a family. And a family, according to the Bible, is a real body. The two become one flesh. Suppose you went to a country where 50% of the individual citizens committed suicide. Would you say that's a happy country? Would you say that country has a hopeful future? Of course not. Welcome to the United States of America, where 50% of all marriages end in divorce. So we now know who our enemy is. We also know our enemy's most powerful weapon. And this is rather terrifying and rather embarrassing. Our enemy's most powerful weapon is our own sins. They are his colonies in our hearts. And our hearts are the only entrance the devil can get into God's world. Because everything else is good. Everything else God made. The devil can't touch the universe God made. Only our free choice to say no to God instead of yes offers any power over human life to the devil. So who are we? We are the body of Christ. That's the fundamental meaning of the word the church. The mystical body of Christ. Pope John the 23rd called church Mater et Magistra. Church is our mother. That's a very intimate, very body-centered image. And our teacher, both. And John Paul II echoed that in saying that the church's Marian dimension, according to which the church is our mother, spiritual mother, is even more important than the church's Petrine or Peter dimension. That is, the church is our authoritative teacher. St. Paul said something very shocking in his first letter to the Corinthians. He took so seriously our identification with Christ that we are now members of his body. And that's not a metaphor. It's literally true. That he wrote to the Corinthians, the Corinthian Christians, many of whom were visiting prostitutes, because Corinth was famous for that. So Christians just went along with that. He said, well, when you have sex with a prostitute, you make Jesus Christ have sex with a prostitute. Check it out. Check out the first 3 or 4 verses of 1 Corinthians 6. That's how real our union with Christ is. That's the worst thing about sin. Okay, this is a very serious war. There is no more serious war than this. In one sense, it's thousands of years old. It began in the Garden of Eden. In another sense, it's heating up much more concretely and quickly and scarily here and now. Not much in the rest of the world. The church is hemorrhaging and losing members at a fantastic rate throughout Western civilization, Europe and North America. Nowhere else. It's thriving in Africa. It's thriving in China and Islamic countries where it's persecuted. But here, the news is pretty bad. We're losing. We're losing more quickly, I think, than ever before in the history of Christianity. I'm not an expert on all the little details here, but I think I know enough about history to know that there has never been a more rapid and radical hemorrhaging or loss of practicing Christians in a major culture in 2,000 years. For every person who becomes a Catholic this year, 6 people will leave. In Europe, it's 10 to 1. Church attendance 2 generations ago in America was 80%. Now it's 20%. In Holland, my name is Dutch, my 4 grandparents were both born in Holland, 2% of the people are found in church on Sunday morning. In England, more people worship on Friday in mosques than worship the Church of England on Sunday in churches. Even within the Catholic Church in America, which is still much more religious than almost every European country, except perhaps Poland and Hungary. In America, 2/3 of the Catholics, according to the polls, don't believe that Christ is really present in the Eucharist. They think it's just a symbol. In other words, they're Baptists. A majority of Catholics, a majority, are, at least politically, pro-abortion. Over 90% approve of and actually practice contraception. A majority of Catholics approve homosexual marriage. And very soon, a majority will approve transgenderism. An amazing, radical shift of opinion in about 1 generation. Why so quick? Well, I don't know. I know that we are more influenced by the media than anybody else, and the media are massively anti-Christian. Back, I think 20 years ago there was a secular polling company in Baltimore called the Wasteland Group. They're still there. They asked media personnel, people who had authority to determine what was shown and what was out in the media, movies, TV, etc., their opinions about moral and religious matters. They discovered that, I think this is back in the year around 2000, 90% of ordinary Americans said that it's not a good idea, it's somehow wrong for a man to cheat on his wife. 49% of the media people believe that. They asked the people in America, have you been in a church or a synagogue or a mosque or any religious house of worship during the last 12 months for anything other than a wedding or a funeral? And something like 70% said, well, yes, occasionally. 11% of media people had ever darkened the doors of anything like a church. And the most telling statistic of all was that they divided the abortion question into 3 categories. Number 1, radically pro-choice. Number 2, radically pro-life. 3, the muddled middle. 97% of media are radically pro-choice. 1% radically pro-life, 2% muddled middle. The media are our teachers. There are schools, universities, that's formal education, but at almost every stage, our citizens are much more susceptible to and educated by the popular media, although the universities and from kindergarten through university are pretty much on board with this too. There was I think he's still alive, an Italian Marxist named Gramsci, very intelligent, very smart Marxist philosopher, who famously said to his fellow Marxists, we Marxist-Leninists, we communists are never going to win the world on the battlefield. And we're never going to win the world in the ballot box. But we shall win the world in the classroom. It's happening. Okay, this is pretty bad news. Does the future look better? I don't think so, frankly. In Canada, they're celebrating suicide. They're having suicide parties. A few years ago, I'm not sure just when, maybe 10 years ago, a cannibal in Germany advertised on the internet for willing victims. He got 28. And the authorities didn't know what to do about it. There was no law against it. Why not? All aspects of marriage have been chipped away. Marriage is no longer a committed relationship between one man and one woman. Well, why can it only be two men or only two women? Why not more? Why not polyamory? Why not? Nobody has an answer to that question. And if I know the devil at all, I know that he is never, ever going to be satisfied. It's going to get worse and worse unless we do something about it. I think the most dangerous people in the world might be the people right here in this country, in Silicon Valley, California, where the so-called transhumanists are working on artificial immortality by either genetic engineering or by artificial intelligence, by somehow putting your mind into a machine, which will store it forever. Well, the scientists, I understand, are divided on whether this is theoretically possible. There are living organisms which are immortal. If you've ever seen an amoeba under a microscope, amoebas don't die unless by accident something else eats it. They die externally. They're so simple, they're not genetically programmed to say, thou shalt get old and die. Cancer cells don't die until their host dies. And these transhumanists are working on how to learn the secret of immortality from these simple organisms so that they can just make that one alteration in whatever chromosome is programmed to say, thou shalt get old and die. And they'll say, no, we're going to reverse that, thou shalt never get old and die. Then you have a person who's just like us, who would grow old and never older. At, let's say, age 33, you'd be stabilized forever. You wouldn't die except by accident. Now, I hope that won't happen. I hope it can't happen, although I'm not sure. But if it does happen, I'll make a prediction. The prediction is that'll be the end of the world. Because if everybody takes the immortality pill, you'll have literally hell on earth. Death is our only exit from this insane asylum. Or, to put it in the words of C.S. Lewis, we're like eggs at present. We must either hatch or go bad. And death is hatching. So if you want to see the utopian society that the transhumanists are preparing for us, just take a dozen eggs and leave them on the kitchen table for a year and then come back and smell. If you want to read the two most prophetic books of our time, I suggest you read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis and Brave New World, a novel by Aldous Huxley. We're already 75% into Brave New World. And the reason Lewis uses such a radical title, The Abolition of Man, is that what defines a human being is the moral heart, the moral soul. And if conscience itself can be altered, whether by propaganda or by genetic engineering. Then you have an ape with a computer. You've got a human body and you've got a clever brain, but you have no heart, no soul, no moral sense. Ours is the first culture in the entire history of the world, the majority of whose teachers, both in formal education and in media, no longer believe that there is anything like a real natural moral law. The vast majority are moral subjectivists and moral relativists. Now, there have always been some philosophers like Nietzsche who taught that, and some groups like the ancient sophists and skeptics who taught that, but they've always been in the minority. Today, they are in the majority. All right, that's the bad news. Is there good news? Well, I don't know, but we have to do something. We have to respond. The one thing we can't do is just ignore it, hide away. Say, let the society go to hell, I'll save my own soul. We're here not just for ourselves, we're here for the world. We've got to be soldiers. But we can't politicize this either. We can't make the mistake of turning our religious passion into who to vote for. Besides, what's the choice, for goodness sakes? How wonderful that this democracy where the people rule, almost everyone hates both of the candidates, and yet nobody can do anything about it. Let's not be naive and optimistic. The enemy, the Antichrist, will never be satisfied. He's like a black hole. A black hole keeps sucking in everything into itself until it has the whole universe. But let's not be pessimists, because we have been assured by God Almighty that the war is going to end and he's going to win. The poor devil doesn't have a chance. He got whooped 2,000 years ago. Christ is infinitely stronger than Antichrist. Why then is he allowing Antichrist so much room? For the same reason he allows us to sin. For reasons unknown to us, but known to him. Here, the verse in the Bible that I find the most difficult to believe is also the verse that I find most easy to prove. The verse is Romans 8, verse 28. All things work together for good for those who love God. That's very difficult to believe, because it certainly looks like that's not true. But it's provable unless you're an atheist. If there's a God at all, if there's a God worthy of the name God, he has to have at least three attributes. He has to be good, benevolent, can't be wicked. A wicked God isn't a God. Secondly, he has to be wise. He can't be stupid. Thirdly, he has to be omnipotent. He created the universe. He can't be weak. So if your God is not stupid, not wicked, and not weak, then it logically follows that the only reason he allows evil is for a greater good. Why did he allow the worst evil that ever happened in the entire history of the world, the deliberate torture and murder of his own son, by the whole world, symbolized by the three languages in which the accusation against Christ was on the cross: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. The Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, they all killed God. Worst thing that ever happened. Worst sin in history. And we dare to celebrate that on a holiday that we call Good Friday. That's our salvation. If God can bring the greatest good out of the greatest evil, he can bring other goods out of evils in ways that nobody in the world foresaw or understood. That's why you need faith. You don't see that. Are there signs that he is working? Are there signs that divine providence has not abandoned us? Many. Many. God is raising up saints everywhere. The saints are usually not always, but usually little people. Like Teresa of Lisieux, one of the most popular saints of modern times. Very simple. Uneducated, simple little girl. Called herself the Little Flower. One of the most powerful and popular saints in history. Another Teresa, Teresa of Calcutta. Little, shriveled, ugly woman. Beautiful, beautiful. All those wrinkles, all those twinkles, love and sorrow meeting. I met her once, just for a few minutes, came to our local parish. 200 people online waiting to greet her. She was very patient, took about an hour to get through everybody. She had 5 seconds for everybody. In those 5 seconds, all she said was, "God bless you." The world passed away. Nobody else was there except me and her. Never felt such attention. Total attention. I was the only person in the world for her. Well, that's how God's going to treat us in heaven. Saint Faustina, author of the Divine Mercy book. Wonderfully simple. Incredibly simple. Her 5-word prayer, Jesus, I trust in you. It's all in there. That's it. That's everything. In the places where Christianity is poor, persecuted, apparently hopeless, it's springing to life. Africa. We used to send missionaries there. What a laugh. They're sending missionaries here. Their seminaries are overflowing. Miracles are happening. Passion there. My goodness. Throughout history, the devil has not learned his lesson. He keeps persecuting the church. Well, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. When the church got persecuted, it grew like crazy. When it became rich and fat and comfortable, it got decadent, it decayed, but it never died, never will. We're promised that until the end of time, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. We're not promised that it's going to be easy or comfortable, or that we're going to win all the wars. But we are promised that we are on the inevitably winning side. So we have to be ultimately happy. But we had better be realistic enough to be proximately unhappy with how things are. Got to do something. Got to fight. All right? So we're soldiers of Christ. We fight. Christ fought. He came to fight. What are our weapons? Well, one of them is divine revelation. We're guaranteed eventual success. We're also guaranteed that there will be a terrible price and a terrible sacrifice. And that we're not just going to be going uphill every day and every way, getting better and better. In fact, towards the end of the world, the things will get worse, according to the book of Revelation. We don't know how close we are to that. It might be tomorrow, it might be another 10,000 years. We have faith. Faith is a gift of God. Faith is not a choice that you make by calculating alternatives and saying, well, I think I'll bet on God. Faith is trust. Faith is putting everything that you have in one bank, banking on that bank. The first supernatural bank and trust company, which is the church. And obey. Not just faith, also works. If works don't follow your faith, that's fake faith, that's dead faith. So we've got to do the works of Martha in the spirit of Mary. You know the Mary and Martha story. 2 saints. One did all the work, the other did just the simple thing of sitting at the feet of Christ. You need to do both. Christ himself told us to pray, thy kingdom come. Where does Christ's kingdom come? In our hearts. The kingdom of God is within you, says Jesus. Already, if you believe in me. But then, right after that, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So we've got to fight earthly battles, like Martha, both. Trust and obey, the two most important things in the world. And the two things that God is, namely love and truth, absolute love and absolute truth, they're eternal, they're immortal, they're omnipotent, they can't be stopped. They're two absolutes. They're two absolutely absolute absolutes. Don't ever set one against the other. Don't ever sacrifice one for the other. Don't ever compromise truth. Don't ever compromise love. Justice is not as absolute. Justice is simply truth as applied to morality. And justice is the presupposition of love and mercy and forgiveness. But it's not the end. Even social justice, terribly important, but it's not the most important thing in the world. And by the way, if you're into social justice, good for you. But the most important, obviously most important issue of social justice today is the 1 million or so children that we are killing in the womb. What other weapons do we have? Well, we have the greatest weapon in the world. We have Christ himself, present with us still. Behold, I am with you always till the end of the world. He is really, really there in the Eucharist. If you don't believe that, you're not a Catholic. If you saw him literally present, divinity and humanity, and within his humanity, body and soul, and within the body, flesh and blood, if you saw the whole Christ as his disciples did, standing right in front of you, what would you do? You would adore him. Well, he is just as really present in the Eucharist, divinity and humanity, body and soul, flesh and blood, as he was 2,000 years ago. That's the positive thing. The negative thing is we have to give up our idols, all our idols. Anything that we put in God's place as number one, that has to be demoted to number two. It's an old Protestant hymn, very wise. The dearest idol I have ever known, whate'er that idol be, help me to tear it from thy throne and worship only thee. The last command of the last apostle, St. John, last verse of his letter, little children, keep yourselves from idols. The first commandment, according to Jesus, is, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart and soul and mind and strength. We know what to do. There's nothing new here. I feel embarrassed because you came to hear something that you should have heard many times already. It's the oldest story in the world. Nothing new. So let's get out and do it. How? Well, in many ways. We're all different. We all have different talents. We all have different vocations. The thing to do is put everything that you have in front of him and say, what do you want me to do? And then do it. I'm a philosopher. I'm paid to have a lot of ideas and to teach a lot of ideas and to write a lot of books. And the most brilliant idea I have ever had in my life, I had at the age of about 6 or 7, I think. I went to Sunday school in Dutch Reformed Church, Protestant Evangelical Church. Good people, Jesus-loving people, not Catholics, but very good. And I remember once asking my father, who was an elder in the church and a kind of amateur theologian and a very good and wise man, I said, Dad, I'm confused by this Sunday school stuff. There's so much stuff that they teach us and so much stuff in the Bible. I don't understand it all, but I think there's only one thing that's really important, right? It all comes down to just one thing, right? I remember his turning and looking at me. We were driving in the car, suspiciously. No, not one thing. It's all important. What do you mean, one thing? I said, well, all we have to do is ask Jesus, what do you want me to do? And then do it. I remember his face changing. And he said, you're right. I think it's all been downhill from that. But that's pretty much all I've got to say. So I'm going to stop and let you ask questions now. There's a mic being passed around. By the way, there's no such thing as a bad question or a stupid question. In fact, sometimes simple, stupid questions are the best ones, so don't be embarrassed.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was really appreciated. What have you seen, especially being a professor at a leading Catholic university, of the changes over your tenure there, especially as it relates to faith? I mean, the universities are where where the primary attack is coming from, and how can we really fight back, especially when it seems like the enemy has really taken over those institutions, and to really fight back, it's not an instantaneous process. It's probably a multi-decade process. And what seeds of hope are you seeing there?
Well, Boston College is a good place to be. I've been there for a long time. I love it. And if you want a good Catholic and good academic education at BC, you can get it if you know which courses and professors to take. On the other hand, BC used to be a Catholic university. Now it's a Jesuit university. No, that's no. Some very good Jesuits. That's an in-house joke. The institution of the university tends to worship itself and tends to worship its reputation and how high it can get on the U.S. News and World Report list. And that Land O'Lakes statement about 50 years ago that Notre Dame's president fathered was one of the most disastrous mistakes in history. And Pope John Paul II, who loved the truth and loved truth in labeling, set out in Ex Corde Ecclesia the opportunity for any so-called Catholic university to declare itself a Catholic university publicly, and a lot of them have. BC hasn't, but places like Franciscan University of Steubenville and Ave Maria and Thomas Aquinas College have proudly done that. So if you want your kids to go to a Catholic university, find out whether they are.
Thank you.
I recommend BC for intelligent, self-starting people. It's Catholic enough to feel like home, and it's pagan enough to be a mission field.
Hi, thank you, Doctor. That was an excellent talk. And your comments about Nietzsche were very insightful to me. And I was thinking to myself, so perhaps you know the answer to this question, but it seems like Nietzsche's philosophy has become very individualized and very feel-good. I mean, not like originally what you were saying is not good, but now it's like, oh, just be true to yourself. It's not like people looking to see like who's gonna take over society and lead us to some crazy world. It's like, oh, just be true to yourself and do what feels good. And if that's trickled down from Nietzsche, I'm wondering if you know how that transformation happened.
That's not Nietzsche. That's weak Nietzsche. That's watered down Nietzsche. That's pop psychology. Nietzsche went insane because he tried to practice his philosophy. Nietzsche is almost a martyr, certainly a prophet. He was passionate. Most people today aren't passionate, except about sex and autonomy. Let me just do my own thing. Well, There's two ways to die, with a bang or a whimper. Nietzsche died with a bang, we're dying with a whimper. By the way, Nietzsche died after 11 years in an insane asylum. His philosophy had something to do with that. In the front here.
Thank you very much for your talk this evening. As we are in this time where, this culture war, we are not really approaching problems from a shared, really any shared sort of foundation.
Yes, we are.
So-
We're Catholics.
So, I guess my question is, when we as Catholics are interacting with people of the world and trying to proclaim the truth in love, do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how to do that when you might proclaim the truth and you're dismissed as, well, that is not my truth, and it's kind of dismissed because there is no shared foundation whatsoever?
We're not commanded to succeed. We're commanded to speak the truth. That's why they call it fishing, not catching. God's the fisherman. And he doesn't stop when the fish stop biting. He keeps fishing. We've got to do the same thing. The one thing we can't do is calculate what's going to work. Let me see. Let me strategize this. Let me be the general. What's the best strategy? God is the general. He's given us strategy. Truth and love are our absolutes. Never compromise either. Love those who hate you. Love your enemies. Even though they think you're crazy and they hate you for it. St. Paul uses an unusual image for that. He's talking about people who hate you and persecute you. And I'm not sure just what the literal words of the verse are, but the context is people who don't want to hear the truth. What happens when you tell them the truth? And he says, you are heaping coals of fire on their head. In other words, we're still created in the image of God, and our hearts were not programmed by Hollywood or by Harvard, but by heaven. And therefore, when you address somebody like that, who's far, far away from the faith, not just drifting far away, but terrified of it, moving in the opposite direction, and they either call your names or saying, well, that's true for you, but not for me, then insanity. All right, what do? You keep speaking the truth, because there's two people there. There's the mask, and there's the hidden person under the mask. And the mask is created by our society, by our culture, by our post-Christian culture. But what's behind that mask is still the image of God. So don't talk to the mask. That's what Jesus did. They asked him questions. He almost never answered a question directly. Why? Because he saw that the real question was the one behind the question. Nicodemus, for instance, comes to him and says, oh, we know you're a great rabbi and nobody can do these miracles, so you must be from God. And he says, nobody can enter the kingdom of heaven unless he's born again. How did he know that that was Nicodemus's question? He knew. Now, you're not Jesus, you're not infallible, you're going to make all sorts of mistakes, but we've got to try to do that. Speak to the real person there. In other words, don't compromise. Don't worry about results. They'll hate me for it, so what? You want to be like Christ? They hated him. If nobody hates you, you're not very close to Christ. If you're not getting splinters from the cross, you're too far from the cross.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a beautiful presentation.
No, it wasn't, but thank you for saying so anyway.
I I really don't have a question as much as just a suggestion as to the previous question, and that is that not only speaking the truth in love, but your own experience of Jesus and your relationship with him. No one can refute that, and they might try.
You do that more by being than by talking or doing. They see your joy. That converted the world. Here, hard-nosed, practical, educated Romans. How did they convert? They saw the joy that Christians had. They were risking their lives, the only people that helped people get better after the plague. How could they forgive the emperor for sending him to the lions? How could they sing hymns while the lions were eating them? These people are either insane or they've got a secret we've never seen before. You got to be very wicked to meet Mother Teresa and not come away affected. So the most effective mode of evangelism is become a saint yourself. It's the meaning of life anyway. What else is there?
Hi, Doctor. Thank you so much. I know tomorrow's the marriage talk, but I just wanted to ask, all of us were trying to pursue our vocations, and a lot of us feel called or already in our vocation to marriage. So just wanted to ask, what was the best piece of marriage advice that you were ever given?
Tomorrow is a marriage talk? I'm supposed to talk about marriage tomorrow?
Well, you're talking to all the married people tomorrow, apparently. So.
I'm sorry. Say that again, please.
What? Well, basically my question is, what is the best piece of marriage advice you've been given?
Love each other absolutely and totally as your primary vocation. Put nothing, absolutely nothing, except God himself over your spouse. It's very simple. So that's my marriage talk. It was kind of short.
Thank you again for your talk. I appreciated your kind of 9/11 lead-in about the impact that had when that happened. For me, it was, okay, my country, my society, my family, there's this risk, something has really substantially changed. I'm interested, my question is, what was your reaction to the transgender day of visibility being announced for Easter, or on Easter at the same point this last week? Because to me, it was the first time in my life that as a Catholic, I felt like, oh, something is substantially changed where the government is coming right at the Catholic faith.
What was announced for Easter?
So President Biden on Easter made a proclamation. Easter happened to was on March 31st. He designated March 31st as Transgender Day of Visibility. Announcement from the White House on the website, gave a big talk about it. Many people within the administration were on the Sunday talk shows, et cetera, saying that this holiday, which had been started in 2009, officially recognized by the White House in 2021 and the administration, but really proclaimed forevermore as the day. It just happened to be on Easter this year. So it was a kind of a remarkable milestone, similar to me in some ways to 9/11, of wow, the princes and principalities are coming directly at us.
I'm going to have to put a gag order on my tongue in order to answer your question, because I'm going to have to use gutter language to describe that accurately. Wow, I didn't know that. I think even the media must have been embarrassed by that because they didn't blow it up. Or maybe they thought it was so obvious that it didn't need to be said. I don't know. Wow. Well, I look forward to Cannibalism Day.
Hello. So, thank you for the talk. Just wondering, do you think the larger threat to the world today is bad philosophy or a lack of reflection, philosophical reflection?
It's not a lack of philosophical reflection. We have a lot of that. It's bad philosophy. Philosophy is supposed to be the love of wisdom. And wisdom is something that's bigger than you are. You sit at the feet of wisdom. You don't invent it. Philosophers are not very influential anymore. At most times in the history of Western civilization, there were at least some philosophers alive that you were sure would be recognized as great. I don't think there's one alive anymore today. Maybe I'm wrong. And yet philosophy itself is terribly important because, as Solomon says, wisdom is the first thing. So you need to get it, because if you don't have light, you can't see anything. Even the best surgeon in the world and the best hospital in the world can't perform the simplest operation if the lights go out. But it's not cleverness or creative thinking or amount of education or serious enough reflection. It's the direction of wisdom. It's become introverted. It's become egotistic. It's become my truth instead of truth. It's what I can do with it rather than what it can do with me. People often ask me, you teach philosophy? What good is philosophy? What can you do with philosophy? I said, well, I hope nothing, but I hope I can do something with me. More questions, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peter. I guess a lot of what you touched on too was very simply talking about like focusing on Christ, and I was wondering what helps you personally, maybe something you do every day that simply helps you kind of focus on God a little bit more and a little bit better.
My mind. I know what I don't feel. Mm-hmm. I just wrote a book on joy, and the first thing I had to say is, I am not a joyful person. I'm a puddle glum. I'm a pessimist. I'm tempted to despair. And yet I know I have joy because Christ is my joy. My joy isn't my feelings. Joy is not a feeling. Joy is a fact. Faith, too, is not a feeling. Love is not a feeling. We worship feelings in our society. But knowing, that's much stronger than feeling. Feelings are wonderful, and they're God-ordained, and they're naturally human, but feelings are like the waves. They go up and down. They're always roller coasters. We're guaranteed that if we feel good one day, we're going to feel lousy the next day. And we're guaranteed that if we feel in the bottom of everything on one day, that's not going to last either. Nothing lasts, but truth lasts. And God has spoken, and he's infallible. So there's your absolute truth, your absolute knowledge.
Thank you.
There was a Chinese Christian mystic, forget his name, used this illustration. He said, imagine three men walking along on the wall. The first one is first one is fact. Second one is faith. Third one is feeling. So you got them walking in a line. Fact, faith, and feeling. And as long as the man in the middle, namely faith, keeps his eyes ahead on fact, on truth, they all three walk happily along the wall. But then, at one point in their walk, faith starts to worry about feeling and turns around and to see how feeling is doing, takes his eyes off fact, and both he and feeling fall off the wall. But fact never falls off the wall.
What do
do you make of the Jordan Peterson phenomena, and what is he doing that we might be able to employ to help promote the faith in our culture?
He's very intelligent, and he's very honest, and he's speaking the truth that he knows from his standpoint, namely psychology. And he is sharing insights with many people that they're not getting from anywhere else, especially what it means to be a man, what it means to take responsibility for your actions, and what it means to grow up. And he's exposing the ridiculousness of our pop psychology egotism. And that's a very good thing. And I hope he's on the way to becoming a Catholic. His wife already is.
Dr. Kreeft, you said that there was not any great philosopher alive now. Who would you say was the last great philosopher then?
G.K. Chesterton.
Okay.
An absolutely unique mind. He's not included in most philosophy books. He's included in mine. Oh, come on, there's got to be more questions. Over here.
What fact is the world missing most right now?
Could you say that again, please?
What fact? You were just talking about fact
Oh,
and
yes.
faith and feelings that we seem to have turned around. So what fact are most of humanity, Western civilization especially, missing right now?
Christianity. In a single word. Everything God says is a truth. And if a fact is simply a statement that's true, then all of divine revelation is fact. Some things that seem to be facts aren't. There are, well, yeah, let me say this anyway. This is probably a not what you wanted to hear, or a diversion or something, but let's take two statements, one of which seems to be a fact and the other doesn't seem to be a fact. Statement number one: all things are working together for good, even evil things. Number two: 11 plus 2 is 13. Second seems to be a fact, first doesn't. Well, God said the first one, so it is a fact. What about the other one? Well, there's one place where 11 plus 2 is not 13, but 1 on the face of a clock. Now, that's a trick, but God doesn't play tricks.
Okay. Hi, thank you for being here. I guess my question is, the biggest thing I encounter is that people don't care about things that last. They're so stuck on the material world. So what advice do you have on how we can get people to care about things that are eternal, the things that actually last and matter?
Number one, realize that they too, deep down, know that they need something more than these little toys. Most people aren't that stupid. They're conflicted. Number two, don't be afraid to tell them the truth. Whenever they open the door a little bit, put your foot in it a little bit, but don't bang them over the head with the Bible. Don't do something that you know is going to be counterproductive. That doesn't mean not to say something that is not going to upset them. Sometimes you have to upset them. But you usually don't upset them by preaching at them. You usually upset them by loving them, and then when they ask you why, then you bring in Jesus. He's doing it.
That's all we have for questions at this time. Thank you, Dr. Peter Kreeft, for
Thank you
coming
for
out so much.
your wonderful questions.